Scripture in this evening will be taken from Acts 13, 21, 22. Acts 13, 21, 22. And afterward they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul the son of Cis, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony, and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, which shall fulfill all my will.
Good evening. Good to have everyone here this evening. Hope everyone had a restful, good afternoon. I know the kids had a blast. They went out to the farm with Mike and Kim, and they're just all full of stories. With the things they've seen and done this afternoon, they have loved it. That's one of the things I love about being in an area like Northeast Tennessee, is the opportunities that my kids have to be able to get out and enjoy God's creation and to see it from a different perspective than what I can offer them. It's a wonderful thing. If I were to ask you to name a character from the Bible that is known for fighting, the odds are pretty good that you would name David. David always seemed to be involved in a fight of some kind, didn't he? When you sit down and you actually study his life and look at it from beginning to end, one would have the impression that he actually spent more time engaged in fighting than he did in peace. A lot of what David accomplished was through fighting. Now, this lesson that we're going to look at tonight, fight like David, it's not to encourage us to fight physical battles just as David did. My goal is not to arm us with swords and with slings and with stones and send us out there, but the principles that David used physically in his fighting, we can apply to our spiritual fighting. The first I want to look at you tonight is he fought in secret. He fought in secret. I want you to open up your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. The rest of our lesson tonight is actually going to come from 1 Samuel chapter 17. But David, at a very young age, was given the task of being a shepherd. As a boy, he was sent out to watch for the family flocks. And let's read in verses 34 through 36. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing as he has defied the armies of the living God. Israel and the Philistines were drawn up against each other, but they had kind of reached an impasse where no one was willing to go out from Israel and face the giant Goliath. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But David says, I am going to go out and meet him. I'll fight him if no one else will. He goes before King Saul and says, I'm ready. Saul says, who are you to think that you can fight, let alone fight against a giant? You are but a youth. You're a boy. And so David recounts times when he had been out tending the sheep, tending the family flocks. And part of that responsibility that he had in caring for them was not only to provide for them food and water, but also protection. And sometimes this would result in needing to drive away predators. But on some occasions, the predator would appear and snatch a lamb from the flock. Maybe they just were a little bit quicker that day than David, and they would take a lamb and be gone. Now David would have a decision to make. He would have a decision to make at that moment. Would he stay put? Or would he try to reclaim the lamb that had been taken? Now, put us in this situation. Put us out there in the field guarding the flock. And let's say we've got 100 sheep out here. And we're walking around the flock, and on the far side, a bear comes through, snatches one of the lambs, and carries it back into the woods. And we're standing there thinking, oh, do I go after the one or not? How would we reason it in our minds if we were in that situation? Well, it's only one lamb, right? We've still got 99 healthy. It's just one. I can just let that one go. Or maybe we would say, well, it's too dangerous for me to pursue a lion or a bear. That's putting myself at risk. I don't want to do that. If something happens to me, then what's going to happen to the 99 that are left? Or maybe we would say, what about the rest of the flock? One compared to 99? I think I'll stick with the 99. David had no audience before which to perform. He had no one standing there watching over him. He had no supervisor that was looking down from his office saying, well, let's see how David is going to handle this. It was just him and the animals. How easy would it have been for David to sit there and say, who's really going to know what happened? Who's really going to know what happened to this sheep? I could bring the 99 into the fold and we could be counting them, and they say, well, what happened to number 100? Well, is he missing? I guess I don't know. I thought for sure I still had all 100 of them. Are you sure you counted 99? There's a lot of ways in which we would try to reason ourselves out of needing to pursue the one. But not David. Even as a youth, David had integrity. David had a sense of responsibility about him. That even at the risk of his own life, even at the risk of the 99, he was going to pursue that one because it was his job. There is a quote by the author C.S. Lewis. It says, integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. David fought in secret. No one was watching him. He could have just as easily sat there and done nothing. But being a man of integrity, he knew he had to try to rescue the one sheep. What do we do behind closed doors? What do we do when no other physical eyes are watching us? When no one else is around to behold our actions? Are we quick to excuse our way out of serving? Are we quick to explain away the responsibility that we have? When we are Christians in public as well as in secret. But many who claim to be such only display it when there are others around to see it. David knew that he was always being watched, even if there was no one there to see him. Because the ever-present, all-knowing God understands what we do in the deepest, darkest parts of our lives. When we may have the rest of the world fooled into thinking we're something that we are not, God knows. Do we have integrity? Do we display the same integrity in secret as David? But it didn't just stop in secret with David. He didn't just fight when it was easy to do with no one looking, but he also fought in public. Turn back to the beginning of 1 Samuel 17. Beginning of verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, were gathered at CoC, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between CoC and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together. And they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them." There is a media company that is ran by Christians. Some of you may have seen their content on YouTube or Facebook. They're called Apian Media. I personally know the brothers who started that and who run that company. The content that they put out is phenomenal. They actually take trips over to what we would consider the Holy Lands. And they do videos about what transpired there. Their first series was called Following the Messiah. And so it started with the traditional place of Jesus' birth and followed him through various points of his life to the final act of his resurrection. And you get to see the physical places associated with these events that we read about. It really helps to solidify what happened. Well, they had another series after Following the Messiah that was called Searching for a King. And it followed the early days of Israel. After coming out of captivity at the end of the age of the judges, when Saul is set up as the first king of Israel and unifies the people. This is when this instance with David transpires. And one of their episodes is in the valley of Elah, where David traditionally fought Goliath, the traditional spot known for that. And when you see the size of this valley, when you see the size of the mountains on either side, and you see the brook that runs through the valley, that as David was coming by, he stops and picks up the stones. It really brings it alive for you. And so as I was preparing for this lesson, I went back and I watched that episode again. And reading 1 Samuel 17, the first 3 verses, you can picture the Philistines on the south side of the valley, the Israelites on the north side of the valley, the noise, the sounds, the smells that would be coming from the camp, this vast valley in between. The valley of Elah is a half-mile wide from mountain base to mountain base. You have these towering mountains on either side and then a half-mile plain separating the two. We are talking about thousands upon thousands of people on either side of this valley. And so David comes and he tells Saul, "I will go out and I will meet this giant." Saul finally concedes and sends David to face Goliath. And let's begin reading in verse 48. "So it was when the Philistine arose, Goliath, and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaharim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Goliath, a literal giant of a man, wanted a one-on-one fight with any man of Israel's choosing. He didn't care who it was. You send me a man, and we will fight. And whoever wins, that's whose side wins. If Israel's man is victorious, then we will be your slaves. If I am victorious, you will be our slaves. This is what David is up against. No one from the king down wanted to fight the Philistine champion. Saul should have been the first one to say, I will go. But instead, he's sitting back saying, who else is going to go? Looking for someone to take his place. David approached the giant by himself. Even Goliath had another person with him. The armor of Goliath was massive. It was heavy. They estimate it was anywhere between 175 to 250 pounds worth of armor that this man carried. And he had a man whose sole task was to carry his shield before him. And so as David comes out into the valley, and you can hear perhaps the hushed whispers from the Israelites. Who's this? Who's this little runt? What's he doing? He is going to turn us all into slaves. Because whoever fought Goliath, if they lost, everybody lost. This is our hope in this little shepherd boy. And you could hear the taunting and the laughing from the side of the Philistines as they see this little shepherd boy walking out onto the field. Well, this is in the bag for us. Our champion is going up against this little runt of a person. Oh, this is going to be a good day for us. And Goliath sending his man out in front of him, carrying his sword, taunting David as he went. You come out at me with sticks and with stones. And David, looking across that valley, hearing all that's going on and seeing this giant coming towards him, not concerned about the vast audience, the thousands upon thousands of eyes that were watching him, wondering if he was going to die quickly or if it was going to take a while. David did not mind. He did not mind that there were those watching him. He was not going to let the fact that people were watching him pressure him into cowering. We don't like getting up in front of a room of 15, 20 people a lot of times. Fortunately, I have always enjoyed public speaking. Worked out well for me, right? There are some people that are terrified of getting up in front of a handful of people and having to speak. Imagine, if you will, thousands upon thousands Many rooting for your demise. Many thinking you are going to be destroyed, maybe not audibly saying so, but you have no chance of victory as far as they're concerned. When the pressure is put on, what do we tend to do? Shrink back into the smallest package we can manage? Disappear into the woodwork? Try not to stick out? Maybe if things settle down, I'll say something. Maybe when the situation is less hostile, I'll take a stand. But not now. There's too many people watching. There's too many people against me. I can't do it. David said, I don't need anyone to go with me. I don't need your armor. I haven't tested it. It'll be a hindrance to me. Saul said, I want you to take my sword, my shield, my helmet. David said, no. I don't need that. Because fighting in public, fighting before all these thousands of people, he could do it because he had God on his side. How often do we let our resolve be shaken because we forget who is on our side? We don't have a person going before us literally carrying a shield. And so we just assume no one is there. When Paul made the point about his first defense, no one stood with me, but the Lord stood with me, he said. That is what got Paul through that trial, was the fact that God was with him. Is it enough for us that God is with us? Do we need an army of people to go before us in order to render ourselves faithful? If it were just us versus an army, would we be willing to stand for Christ, knowing that many are counting on our demise? Many are cheering for us. But would we go ahead and walk across that plain, knowing that the pressure is not going to cause us to cower? And the reason that David was able to fight in secret, where he could do the right thing when no one was there to make him, the reason he could fight in public when all the people in the world couldn't keep him from serving his God, was because he fought for God. Look at verse 45 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you, and this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hand. A key to the downfall of King Saul is that he stopped fighting for God and fought only for himself. It was no more about doing what God expected of him. It was doing what was good for his image, for his own reputation. Saul wanted to make a name for himself by his own hand. David offers one of the most moving speeches that I have read in all of Scripture. As he faces this giant Goliath, as he comes, you can't even say eye to eye because of the vast size difference. But as David is looking up at this man, how many of us would be trembling at that point? How many of us would have gotten to that point? They estimate that Goliath was between 8.5 and 9 foot tall. That's a big man. That is a big man. The tallest man, I believe, that's lived since then, recorded anyway, I believe his name was Henry Longfellow. And he was 8'6". And there are pictures that you can see of him. You can look it up on the internet and see pictures of him standing next to others. And just how he literally towers over people. But you know, he had a lot of other medical problems that caused him to kind of stoop a little bit. He had no strength with which to support this massive frame. Goliath could support himself and then some. And David comes before this giant. And basically, Goliath had been mocking him about coming with sticks and stones. And David said, it doesn't matter if you come before me with sword, with spear, with javelin. You bring all the equipment you want to, because it's not going to help. You see, I can be victorious with sticks and stones because I fight for God. And it is He who gives the victory. The power does not lie within the weapons that are wielded. David was not fighting for himself. He was not looking to make a name for himself. He wasn't even fighting for Israel. His brethren, his brothers were in that army. Had the two armies collided in the valley of Elah, there would have been mass casualties. And most statistics place the Philistine army as being larger than the Israelite army at this time. And so Israel would have been outnumbered to begin with. But David did not go before Goliath because of Israel. He went before Goliath because the God whom he served had been defied. Are we repulsed at the actions that go against God in today's time? Does it sicken us when people thumb their nose at God and they mock Him and they ridicule Him and they do all they can to disavow Him and to disprove Him, discredit Him? Do we get incensed at that? Or do we just sit back and say, well, they'll get theirs one of these days. They'll get their comeuppance. At least I'm doing what I should do. Now, do we need to start carrying rocks and slings with us, and every time we see someone go against God, we try to heave a stone at them? No. But the point is, David was willing, ready, and able to stand up for his God. Who do we fight for? In our day-to-day, who do we fight for? Do we represent ourselves only? That is the point Saul eventually reached in his life, where he was only concerned with serving himself. Whatever made Saul look good, that is what he would do. Do we represent God as long as it does not adversely affect ourselves? I'm willing to stand up for God and I'm willing to follow Him as long as no one else has a problem with that. But as soon as someone starts pushing back, or as soon as there's a little kickback against our position, well, we'll just fold and crumble, and that's the end of that. As long as I'm comfortable, I will serve God. Or do we represent God no matter the perceived outcome for ourselves? That's what David did. David knew that there was a likelihood that Goliath could overcome him. David did not have this protective bubble around him that kept him immune from all sorts of problems. If it were God's will that Goliath be victorious that day, he was going to be victorious. But David knew that it was up to him to stand for God, regardless of the outcome. If it was God's plan that David die that day, then so be it. He was still going to stand for God. Do we represent God no matter the perceived outcome? We can't see the future. We can't know the end of every predicament that we're going to encounter. We sometimes live as though we can, and we make our plans accordingly. But you know, being a Christian is not a passive role. Being a Christian is not something we hold in title only. It is not something that is written on a certificate that we get after we've been baptized that says you are now a Christian and you can just go about your regular everyday life that you are accustomed to. How many references in the New Testament can we find where God's people are referred to as an army, as fighting, putting on the armor of God? You know, if I didn't know any better, I'd think it sounds like we are in a war. How about you? We forget many times that every day we awaken to fight again. Because the enemy isn't giving up. He is there every moment, waiting for us to make a mistake, waiting for us to give him an edge. Let's not give it to him. Let's not give him any more help. We all have battles that we fight in our lives, some individually, in private. We battle with things that others may not know about. We have to fight those battles ourselves. But there are also battles that we fight collectively, as brothers and sisters. As God's family, we decide to take a stand for God. There have been rumors going around for months, even years now, of pressures being put on the church. God's people being rubbed under the thumb of politicians and social elites who think they have the answers to everything. It is very possible that we are going to be thrust in the most public battle of our physical lives. Are we ready and willing to fight for God? Or are we going to look around and say, who's up? Whose turn is it? It's not mine. I fought yesterday. As long as we are part of God's family, the fight is never over until He comes to claim us. And we need to stand strong until the end. I went back and listened to Drew Leonard's lesson on Wednesday that he had on pornography. Wonderful lesson. I'm glad for the technology that allowed me to go back and listen to it again. And one of the main focuses in that lesson was about having our hearts prepared. Having our hearts ready. I want to ask you tonight to prepare your hearts to fight like David. Because if we're not ready to, we're not going to. When David was alone watching the sheep and that bear came, it wasn't a matter of David sitting down and trying to decide what he was going to do. He already knew what he was going to do. He had been tasked with protecting that flock, and he was going to see to it that he did. When he went to the battlefront, it was not a decision for him to sit down and wonder over, am I going to fight this giant or not? He already knew that he was going to fight publicly. Because it was the right thing to do. In every step of his life, David knew whom he was fighting for. And it didn't matter the size of the fight. As long as he was fighting for God, he was going to be victorious. The reading that we had in Acts chapter 13, I want you to think about what is said of David. In verse 22, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. May each of us live in a way that this can be said of us, that we are a people after God's own heart, that we seek to do His will entirely. That is what made David such a great fighter. It wasn't in his physical strength, it wasn't in his strategical ability, but it was in the fact that he fought for God and with God. That is what made him victorious. But we can't begin to fight until we join the army. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the movie Rambo, or at least heard of it. I don't know, there's like 15 of them out, I don't know. They made a lot of them. But this Rambo character was one who had been kind of forgotten by the army, and he was, in a sense, an army of one. And while he enjoyed some success, an army of many can be much more successful than one. Are we part of God's army tonight? Are we part of His family? It's all the same. You don't like the talk of wars and fighting? Makes you a little squeamish? Well, let's talk about family and love. That's what God offers. That's what God offers to all individuals who would submit themselves to His plan of salvation. Are you ready to do that tonight? Are you ready to be immersed? To die with Christ in water, to be raised a new creature? Sinless. Ready to fight for God the rest of your days. Remaining faithful is an act that will follow us until our last breath. Salvation is not 5 one-and-done steps. Yes, there are some things that we do once, as far as baptism. We'll look at that, Lord willing, next week in our series. But remaining faithful means that we live the life God has called us to live. And that means being willing to fight for Him. And that means fighting in secret when no one is watching and fighting in public when everyone is watching. Because we fight for Him. The opportunity is given now to become one of His children, submitting to Him, giving your life over to Him through baptism. We are not guaranteed of any more minutes past this. Many may have seen on Facebook today, Steve Higginbotham, the preacher down at Carnes. I quoted him this morning. He posted on Facebook today that he found out Friday he has stage 4 cancer in several areas in his body. Last time I saw him, the man was healthy as a horse. Still is to some degree. To look at him, you wouldn't know. I know there are hundreds and thousands of prayers going up for him and his family tonight. But a man who is in his prime, one of the most able preachers I have ever been privileged to listen to, just found out that there is something attacking him that is literally life-changing. What if that was one of us? What if tomorrow you go to the doctor and they say, well, you're in pretty bad shape? Are you ready for what comes next? God has given us the method by which to get ready. And that no matter what we face, no matter what problems we come up against, no matter what trials we endure, He will see us through to the end of them. And we can know that even if our life be taken here physically, that we have an eternal life waiting for us, the joys of which we cannot begin to describe, the comfort we will receive beyond anything we can imagine here. So I want you to consider yourselves tonight. As we sing this song of invitation, I want you to reflect on your own life and your own standing with God right now. If there needs to be a change, then make it while you have time. This is not a time to be shamed of what you have done. If you are thinking right now that my life is not right with God, it's because the shame has led you to that point. You may be thinking, well, Chris, you're spending an awful lot of time talking about this. There's a reason. Because I want to give everybody in here as much time to think about it as they can. A couple weeks ago, I made the comment at the end of the lesson that responding to the invitation, taking that step and walking down that aisle has been made to be a walk of shame over the years. And I had a lot of support given to me afterwards. A lot of people appreciated that thought. That we should not view this as a shameful moment, but as a moment of joy. That someone has realized, I need to be right with my Creator, and I'm doing it now. Are you ready to do that now? And you know you need to. You know that in your current state, should your life end tonight, you will be eternally separated from God. There is no scarier thought that can be contrived than that. The invitation is extended to you now. The Lord has given you this opportunity. Make the most of it. If you need to respond to the invitation, let us know by coming to the front as together we stand and sing.